The Many Factors in Decompression Stress by Dr. Neal Pollock, performed by Dr. Franz Cronier. For much of the past century, a small number of algorithms have been used to estimate divers' decompression obligations. Advances in recent decades, however, have provided an array of mathematical models used in personal dive computers. All current computer models base their assessment almost exclusively on pressure time profiles of a dive. While this is certainly the most important element of decompression sickness risk and can provide excellent guidance, many factors influence the total gas uptake and elimination, and ultimately decompression safety. Divers therefore can reduce their risks further by thinking beyond the simplicity of the current algorithms. The variables affecting decompression stress can be clustered into four broad categories: dive profile, exercise profile, temperature profile, and predisposing factors. We'll consider each in turn. First, the dive profile. Even for situations in which all the other factors work against decompression safety, if the dive profile does not generate significant decompression stress, decompression sickness will not develop. Critical elements of a dive profile include the time spent at each depth, the ascent rate, stop depth, stop duration, and breathing gases used. Recent or previous dives can alter the impact of all these variables. Subtle effects are created by water density, in other words, whether it's fresh or salt water, and atmospheric pressure at the surface, for instance, at altitude. The lower the atmospheric pressure is at the surface, the greater the decompression stress is for any given dive. So, whilst the greatest reduction in atmospheric pressure comes with increasing altitude, fluctuating weather conditions also have a minor effect. Most algorithms used in dive computers provide adequate protection for typical recreational exposures, but decompression sickness can develop, even in people who dive within the limits of the models. The risk results from a complex interplay of the dive profile, temperature, exercise, and a host of individual factors. For some, the anticipated risk level associated with current decompression algorithms is acceptable. Most don't even know what it is. Others may desire additional buffers to address differences in susceptibility or risk tolerance. Gradient factors offer one useful way of altering this. Refer to the relevant Alert Diver article on this subject. The second factor, exercise. Both the timing and intensity of exercise can have a substantial influence on decompression safety. In the broadest sense, exercise during descent and bottom phases of a dive promotes circulation and therefore increases potential inert gas uptake, thereby effectively increasing decompression stress during the subsequent return to the surface. Conversely, light to moderate exercise during ascent and stop phases will increase circulation and promote safe inert gas elimination, thus reducing decompression stress. What makes it problematic, though, is that higher intensity exertion during the ascent or stop phases, or soon after the dive, can also promote bubble formation and effectively increase decompression stress. The best prepared divers will have the equipment and skill to control the amount of exercise needed before, during, and after diving. Exercise intensity should be kept as low as possible during the descent and bottom phases. Light exercise on the order of no more than 2 or 3 times resting effort, which translates to 2 or 3 metabolic equivalents or METs, and with low forces on the joints, is appropriate during the upper, ascent, and stop phases to help increase the rate of inert gas elimination. High-intensity exercise should be avoided, as well as exercise involving high joint forces. If undesirable physical activity is required by virtue of where the dive takes place, for instance in caves or in sinkholes or with shore ascents and entries, profiles should be made conservative to compensate for this increased risk. The third factor is thermal stress. The thermal status of a diver can also have a substantial influence on the decompression status. A study by the US Navy provides a very elegant example of this. Dives were divided into two phases: descent, bottom, and ascent and stopped. The water temperature was kept constant in a given phase to produce warm or cold, or perhaps more accurately, cool status. Dives were carried out with the phases matched: warm-warm, cold-cold, and mismatched: warm-cold and cold-warm. Divers exercised throughout. The greatest differences in decompression sickness were evident between warm-cold and cold-warm exposures. The warm-cold condition yielded a decompression sickness rate of 22%, whereas the cold-warm condition was extended to more than twice the bottom time and still produced a decompression sickness rate of only 1.3%. Even if the effects of this study are exaggerated by a prolonged ascent or stop phase that allowed for bottom changes, the results document a dramatic impact based on the timing of the thermal status variations. Diver thermal status, in other words, not the temperature of the water but the temperature of the diver, will almost certainly be measured in the future. But meaningful monitoring will require new devices and more research data to adjust the algorithms appropriately. Maintaining neutral thermal status during descent and bottom phases, while certainly avoiding unnecessary overheating, and trying to achieve mild or warm status without high-intensity exercise during ascent will reduce the risk of decompression sickness. The difficulty comes in reconciling the optimal practices for decompression safety with divers' desires and normal practices. Pouring warm water into wetsuits pre-dive or placing chemical hot packs inside suits is being replaced by active heating garments, available for both wetsuits and dry suits. The problems with these strategies is that they increase inert gas uptake early in the dive, when uptake is typically already at its highest. As the warm water and chemical hot packs lose their effectiveness over time, the active heating systems can weaken or fail, and the warm-cool pattern associated with the greatest risk of DCS can develop. Active heating garments do have a legitimate value, but they should be used thoughtfully. Warming should never be greater than is needed, and divers should consider a low or offsetting early in the dive, and a gradual increase in warming during the ascent. Caution is required in increasing active heating during ascent, since gas solubility decreases in tissues as they warm, potentially promoting bubble formation before blood perfusion increases the circulation to remove them. Divers must also be aware that post-dive warming can increase decompression risk. For instance, taking a hot shower or getting in a hot tub decreases tissue solubility for inert gas and can promote bubble formation. Ultimately, divers need adequate warmth to preserve clear thinking and physical performance. But they should be mindful of the decompression hazards created by thermal manipulation. For many divers, passive systems are adequate to maintain physical and cognitive performance. Those who need or desire active warming systems should be aware that they can fail, and if it goes wrong, it may increase their risk of decompression stress. Fourth factor, predisposition. Predisposition is a catch-all category that includes a range of personal factors that can influence decompression stress. The impact of each of them may range from negligible to substantial for a given individual and dive. None of these parameters are currently quantified sufficiently to incorporate them into decompression algorithms. Understanding the potential impact, however, can help divers manage their actual risk. Let's consider some of the details here. State of hydration. Proper hydration is important for general and diving health. Dehydration can increase the risk of decompression sickness, and overhydration may promote immersion pulmonary edema. Practically, it's probably fair to say that the diving community has sometimes focused too much on dehydration as a risk factor for decompression stress. This may arise from two realities. First, since fluid shifts and indications of marked dehydration can be a consequence of decompression sickness, there can be some confusion over cause and effect. Second is the human desire to simply find something to blame. The next subgroup under predisposition is physical fitness. Divers should be physically fit enough to meet the normal demands of a dive, with sufficient reserve capacities to handle emergencies. The higher the level of physical fitness, the lower the relative strain of a dive. Optimal body composition also reduces the amount of ballast that is necessary to maintain neutral buoyancy. And in the case of an obligatory post-dive climb-out, it also reduces the absolute effort that's required. Limited data have associated higher levels of physical fitness with reduced post-dive bubble formation and a lower risk of decompression sickness. The biggest practical challenge typically arises with the efforts to schedule exercise around the busy dive trip. While limited findings suggest that a single bout of high-intensity exercise performed 24 hours before diving may be protective, the data concerning exercise closer to the start of the dive is confusing. Exercise should probably be avoided pre- and post-dive where possible. The next consideration is decompression history. An individual's history of decompression sickness may indicate a greater predisposition, either physiologically or behaviorally. The importance of history may also extend to the buddy, since his or her actions can influence the outcome of this shared activity. Age. The impact of increasing age is hard to assess, and it may be confounded by reduced levels of physical fitness and changing health and other practices. Increasing age is associated with increases in bubble formation, and this potentially does indicate reduced tolerance for decompression stress. Gender. There's no compelling evidence in diving literature to suggest that gender plays a role in developing decompression sickness. This runs somewhat contrary to limited amount of data from altitude work, suggesting that the physiological risk may vary according to the menstrual cycle, being slightly elevated during the first half of the cycle. Practically speaking, even if women do have a slightly elevated risk, it is still ultimately very low. Circulation. Compromised circulation resulting from prior injury has been viewed as a possible risk factor, but there's little scientific evidence. Presence of a patent foramina vale has the potential to alter circulation and allow bubbles to transfer from the right to the left side of the heart and potentially cause increases or more severe decompression sickness. But perspective is required. The frequency of PFO is relatively high, about a quarter of the population, whereas the incidence of serious decompression sickness is low. The degree of patency varies, and this can be important. PFOs are not the only way that bubbles can move into the arterial circulation. They can cross the lungs, particularly during exercise, or while climbing out of the water, for example. So dive profiles that minimize bubble formation provide the greatest protection, since there are no bubbles or will be less bubbles to cross over. Biological health. A host of factors fall under the category of biological health, and these may influence decompression stress. Some probably play minor roles, others probably more important ones. Nutritional status, for example, is important for general health and physical fitness, and it may influence the biochemical response to decompression stress. Similarly, there's the potential for interaction between drugs and diving, and this is another area where there is virtually no research data. Genetic predisposition and epigenetic expression probably also has importance, but this research is only starting now. Next, acclimatization. Acclimatization is defined as the adaptive change in response to a repeated natural exposure. The effect may be positive or negative, and so repetitive diving could influence decompression stress in either way, not just through the presence of residual inert gas. Positive acclimatization could produce a reduction in biochemical response, and so the body's reaction to bubbles may decrease. Negative acclimatization could produce a heightened response, whereby the body responds more promptly. The published data are conflicting. The effect of positive acclimatization could easily be masked by patterns of increasing exposure intensity over a series of dives. In summary, most personal factors that affect decompression stress can be modified. Maintaining reasonable levels of physical fitness, nutrition, restfulness, and hydration all contribute to good health and good diving health. Good health can reduce physical limitations and the need for medication. When selecting dive buddies, divers should consider the compatibility of goals, risk tolerance, skills, knowledge, and capabilities. A shared understanding of both risks and best practices can improve operations and readiness. Thoughtful and well-informed divers know more than the current dive computers know about the conditions that may affect risks during a dive, and this is likely to continue for years to come. Being conscious in real time of conditions that may alter risk can make it easier to build in appropriate buffers to promote safety. Small changes towards conservatism, when applied across a variety of factors, can enhance safety with little impact on what can be accomplished during a dive.